Good morning, everybody. I think we'll make a start. We've still got a few people due to join us, but I want to make sure that we get sort of everything covered and finished on time. My name's Ashley White. I am head of AML CFT at the FSA. Thank you for joining us today. This is our second AML CFT update session this year. And today we are talking to you about MONEYVAL and also about the NRA. We will then have a panel session with representatives from both the FSA and from Cabinet Office within the Isle of Man government. So today, I'm delighted to welcome George Permain, who is our external advisor, sort of helping us with some of our preparation for the evaluation. I'll let George introduce himself fully, but George was the head of delegation for Jersey, and he was also working at the FATF Secretariat. So we're really grateful to have George and his experiences with us today. The panel session can be about MONEYVAL, it can be about NRA. There'll be representatives from both the FSA and Cabinet Office, so please do send us your questions. We've got the Slido code up on the screen there. Also happy for audience questions as well. So we'll have a microphone if anyone does have any questions from the audience. So we are scheduled to finish probably around 10:45. Representatives from the FSA and Cabinet Office will be here till about 11. So if anybody does have a question they don't want to raise sort of in the venue, just come and see us after. We're here for a few minutes. Okay, and I am now going to hand over to George, who will be talking to us about MONEYVAL and the FATF.
Thank you, Ashley, and good morning, everyone. Just checking I don't fall off a stage as I head around here. Thank you so much for welcoming me again to the Isle of Man. It's lovely to be back here in Douglas. I see a number of faces that I think I've seen before, and I'm imagining a number of you may have been at the Countering Financial Crime Conference last month. That was hopefully a useful introduction to something around the MONEYVAL process, but the purpose of today is to dive a little bit deeper and to give you a bit more of an idea of what the Isle of Man will go through over the next 18 months or a little bit longer or so. In fact, it's about 12 months or so to today, give or take, when the assessment team will arrive on the Isle of Man. No date yet confirmed. So it seems to be quite an apt time to have a conversation about what should be expected here and how the Isle of Man will go through the assessment process. So a bit more background about me. I was head of delegation for Jersey, who went through its report under the previous round in 2024. I used to work at the FATF Secretariat, and I've been involved in numerous evaluations around the world and also working with countries who are in and exiting the grey list system, both as a lead reviewer and now advising them on kind of how to prepare for evaluations and how to get out. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about understanding what MONEYVAL is, then a bit about the timeline, and then, because I know a number of you will be more technical in the field of AML CFT because you're here today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the actual methodology will work and what you could expect from the evaluation when some of you lucky people will be volunteering to meet the evaluation team and what can actually occur. So who is MONEYVAL? Well, hopefully you've all heard of the FATF. The FATF is the international standard setter. They set the standards, and the FATF also evaluate countries. They only evaluate about, give or take, 38 or so countries who are their members. The rest are covered by what are called FATF-style regional bodies, or FSRBs, and MONEYVAL is one of those. So think of it as basically FATF's European regional body. It was established in 1997 under the Council of Europe. So just to be clear as well, the Council of Europe is a different body from the European Commission or the EU. It's a separate body which basically supports good governance, the rule of law, and human rights. And it's basically a permanent monitoring body of the Council of Europe. The important distinction here is that 19 Council of Europe member states are evaluated directly by the FATF. Those are the likes of, for example, France, Germany, etc. But MONEYVAL evaluates 27 Council of Europe member states, including the Isle of Man. MONEYVAL also evaluates a number of non-Council of Europe members. So that will be Israel, who's evaluated jointly with the FATF, the Holy See, which is a fairly unique evaluation to go on if you fancy going to the Vatican. And then, of course, the Crown Dependencies face an interesting position. We are kind of members of the Council of Europe through the virtue of the United Kingdom internationally representing us. but we have our own separate personality inside MONEYVAL. So we have our own flags, we make our own points, we have our own precedents. And I think over the last 10 years or so, since we've been members of it, the Crown Dependencies have made quite a mark in MONEYVAL in talking quite positively about their work on AML and CFT. So a critical point here is that MONEYVAL uses exactly the same standards and methodology as the FATF uses. They have their own processes and procedures, which are slightly Europeanified, but broadly it's the same process. For evaluations, all countries are placed under something called the universal procedures, and that's to ensure whether you are the Isle of Man or whether you are Botswana in Africa or whether you are Chile in South America, you are actually evaluated in broadly the same way. And the idea is to achieve a level of consistency across the evaluation process. Two FATF members also participate actively in MONEYVAL. In fact, more participate in MONEYVAL, but two are formally always part of it. And at the moment, that's Germany and the UK. And that's to kind of really further strengthen the link to the FATF as kind of the mothership of everything that goes on. And delegates who go to MONEYVAL plenaries, well, they're broadly senior officials from governments, regulators, FIUs, law enforcement, and legal experts from ministries of justice. You occasionally get prosecutors and the likes there. Those are the people who attend and comment on reports. They are the ones who do the evaluations, and they're the ones also who are mainly involved in the public sector side of evaluations. I'm going to talk a bit about how the evaluation works on technical compliance and effectiveness as we kind of go through this. But before that, I want to talk about where the Isle of Man is in terms of its timeline. So we are kind of at the process at the moment of starting around kind of how the Isle of Man timeline will work. In November, there will be country training that will occur in the Isle of Man, and that will be towards, there's a slide on this in a little bit, towards the end of November. Two members of the MONEYVAL Secretariat will come to the island and will talk to you from their perspective as to how the evaluation will work, and that will give you an idea of what can be expected from their side. Before that, there'll be ongoing engagement through the Cabinet Office team and the other authorities to ensure people are familiar with what to expect. And don't worry, at that thing in the next kind of 6 weeks or so, you're not going to be placed in a room with a bunch of scary people from different MONEYVAL states and ask questions. It's very much about them telling you what will be expected. And the government and the other authorities will also support you through this time, through trainings, through briefings. So by the time you get to next October, you should know exactly what to expect in the evaluation. The on-site dates will be finally confirmed to the Isle of Man in January, but we know it will likely be sometime in October of 2026. And the on-site will last probably between 2 and 3 weeks in October of 2026. And then the most difficult part for the industry happens, which is that post the on-site, you won't hear anything about what goes on with the evaluation for a long period of time. And there's a reason for that. It's because everything must be kept confidential at that time between the country and the assessment team. And it actually won't be until such a time as the report is finalised and published, which will be in the second half of 2027, when you'll be able to know what the outcome is. And the reason is because the evaluation team in the country have to have a safe space to kind of negotiate the report. And I should say, having been an evaluator lots of times and worked with a country being evaluated and advising lots of countries that are being evaluated, all you're actually looking for is that the report is accurate and truthful. There may be some debate over ratings, but that's what you're trying to kind of perfect during that period of time. So the evaluation process, what does it consist of? Well, it consists of the submission of really, really detailed questionnaires. Ashley's going to talk about the NRA in a second. Whilst there's a lot of stuff for people to be doing, going from doing an NRA and publishing an NRA into preparing your questionnaires for MONEYVAL is a difficult feat. These questionnaires will often run to hundreds, if not, well, they will run to hundreds, if not thousands of pages with hundreds of supporting documents behind them. And they set out meticulously how the Isle of Man system works. So the authorities together will be having to prepare those questionnaires. They're not something that the private sector directly feeds into, but they will talk about the private sector and how the public and the private sector interact in the kind of delivery of the AML CFT CPF regime here in the Isle of Man. The on-site interviews are without doubt the most important part of the evaluation. I always say nothing can make up for great preparation for the on-site, but if the on-site interviews don't go well, ultimately the report will not be a good report. Everything that's done now in the evaluation process is looking to see whether the country actually can demonstrate that it's doing things. Nothing makes up for physical interviews with people, which actually tells an assessment team whether or not they think they understand their risk, how they're applying preventative measures, what's going on in terms of law enforcement action. So those meetings are really designed to actually really kind of press the flesh and understand whether people really do know what's going on. So they are quite intense. The way they work for the private sector is they feel relatively short. In Jersey, when we had them, a number of people weren't eventually selected for interview, and the interviews only last about 40 to 50 minutes. The people who weren't selected for interview were genuinely really disappointed and actually said, please, can we come? And we said, I'm afraid we can't. It's not within our discretion. The assessment team pick it. And the ones that did have interviews were sad when it ended at 50 minutes. They said, we had more. We wanted to kind of tell them and discuss with them. So it becomes quite an interesting exercise. The evaluation team are constrained by the period of time they have, only kind of 2 to 3 weeks, which is long enough for an on-site evaluation, meaning they have to meet a wide selection of industry and public sector. They may also select only a specific number of topics with you, and you might wonder, why have they picked those topics? It might be because they have to ask about all the range of topics in the methodology, and that it was just your sector they chose to ask about that particular topic, be it politically exposed persons, be it enhanced due diligence, be it high-risk third countries, etc. So it can feel a bit odd how the evaluation process goes. The drafting of the mutual evaluation report is the next stage, and that's really the stage where the evaluation team try to reflect accurately everything that they've read in the material and everything that they've seen in the on-site. I should be clear as well, just in case any of you didn't know, we've said it before, but no individual person, no individual firm will ever be named in an FATF or MONEYVAL mutual evaluation report. It's only ever talking generally about sectors or the industry or an authority. So there shouldn't be any worry about confidentiality. That's something that's protected across the whole process. And then ratings are assigned for each FATF recommendation and immediate outcome. And I'll talk a little bit about ratings in a second. So the methodology, I promised to kind of go through this in a bit more detail on how it works. So there's something called technical compliance, which is whether you have the right laws or regulations in place. And then there's effectiveness. And I think this graph, I think if I'm right, it's I've forgotten exactly what this is called again, but it's a something modium strip, I think is the name of this diagram. This reflects it quite well because technical compliance and effectiveness are separate, but they're also intertwined. It's whether really the right laws that you have in place are giving the results of effective intended outcomes in the system. So the evaluation looks as to whether or not you can present evidence that the Isle of Man is actually deterring and preventing financial crime. Technical compliance is basically a kind of more tabular or formulaic exercise. Effectiveness is really what really matters. And as we go into this round, so the second round that the FATF and MONEYVAL have evaluated effectiveness, you can expect them to be placing much more emphasis on effectiveness, so results, rather than whether you simply have a law, a regulation, a guidance in place. So they're actually looking for real demonstrable evidence this time round. So what's technical compliance? Well, there are 40 recommendations of the FATF, and they cover a really wide swathe of things that goes on to create a comprehensive framework of measures to help countries tackle financial crime. So the breadth is pretty striking. It covers pretty much everyone, regulators, FIUs, law enforcement, private sector entities, including things like non-profit organizations. Countries have pretty diverse legal, administrative, and operational frameworks and different financial systems. So it's important to demonstrate through the technical compliance annex how your system works. Risk-based approach here is still the golden thread to actually the evaluation. And in this round of evaluations, the risk-based approach is being heightened. So you can expect the evaluation team to place more emphasis on things that they have determined are materially more risky for the Isle of Man. And what's happening in this round of evaluations is more time is spent earlier with the country considering what your risks are and where the evaluation team should spend their time. That's why, in many reasons, the national risk assessments are so important, which is what Ashley's going to talk to you about in a second. So they may decide that actually there's virtually no point in spending time on, let's say, cross-border cash movement, because the Isle of Man doesn't necessarily have a particular issue in relation to cross-border cash movement. And that can now be legitimately decided, and instead they're going to focus on the Isle of Man's focus on, for example, a higher risk activity or a high-risk country. And the idea behind that is that spending equal amounts of time on equal things is not a particularly useful use of the evaluation team's time. So, moving on to talk about effectiveness. So this is really the kind of so what questions. So the effectiveness methodology is divided up into what's called 11 immediate outcomes. And here I've kind of translated this into so what questions. So how the FATF methodology identifies whether you're actually achieving a successful outcome through your regime. So immediate outcome 1, it's do you understand your money laundering and terrorist financing risks, and do you coordinate policy? Immediate outcome 2, does international cooperation deliver results? Are you actually achieving investigations, prosecutions, convictions through international cooperation, assets being recovered? Immediate outcome 3 and 4, probably the most relevant to people in this room. Do supervisors appropriately supervise financial institutions, VASPs, so virtual asset service providers, and do financial institutions and virtual asset service providers effectively implement AML CFT measures? Immediate outcome 4, exactly the same, but for DNFBPs, one of the most annoying acronyms in the FATF language, designated non-financial businesses and professions, basically lawyers, accountants, estate agents, dealers in precious metals and stones. Immediate outcome 5, my personal favourite, can you obtain adequate, accurate and up-to-date beneficial ownership information when needed? Immediate outcome 6, is financial intelligence used for money laundering and terrorist financing investigations? Critically, not just focusing on what the FIU does, but actually how their intelligence works in an intelligence cycle, with the industry providing SARS, with SARS leading to intelligence analysis, with intelligence analysis forming a basis for money laundering and terrorist financing investigations by authorities. Immediate outcome 7, are money laundering offences investigated, prosecuted and sanctioned effectively? By sanction there, I mean penalties rather than targeted financial sanctions. Immediate outcome 8, are proceeds of crime confiscated effectively? And I'll come on in a second to talk about some changes in this round, which means that that's now a broader approach to how countries can use confiscation measures. Immediate outcome 9, are terrorist financing offences investigated, prosecuted and sanctioned effectively? Immediate outcome 10, a kind of split. Immediate outcome are terrorist financing preventative measures and financial sanctions, targeted financial sanctions, UN targeted financial sanctions implemented effectively. That's the part that's split half in relation to the not-for-profit organisation regime and half in relation to terrorist financing targeted financial sanctions issued by the United Nations. And then immediate outcome 11 are proliferation financing targeted financial sanctions implemented effectively. And those are the 11 IOs on which the Isle of Man will be graded. And the gradings go from low through to high, basically, in terms of the ratings. Low is effectively that you are not achieving the immediate outcome. Moderate is that you are achieving the immediate outcome but with major deficiencies. Substantial is that you are achieving the immediate outcome but with moderate deficiencies. Great and confusing wording there from the FATF. And high is that you are achieving the immediate outcome to a good or a very good extent, basically. And what the FATF consider to be effective are basically substantial and high ratings. We refer to low and moderate ratings as being fail grades and substantial and high ratings as being pass grades. And the Isle of Man will be wanting to ensure they get as many substantial or high grades as possible. And those grades are really, in the Isle of Man's context, what will be most significant to how the Isle of Man report is followed up. Many of you will be familiar with the FATF grey list. It's worth me mentioning it here. That is the kind of the worst, or not, it's not the worst, the blacklist is the worst, but we hope that no one's going anywhere near where North Korea, Iran and Myanmar is. But the grey list is a scenario where you can find yourself if you effectively get less than 3 substantials and 2 lows. So the aim is to gain as many positive ratings as possible, and that's the strategic approach the Isle of Man should take to the evaluation. But of course, it goes beyond just avoiding grey listing. That's not the purpose of this. It's about actually trying to improve the regime for the good of the island, for the good of everyone. So we're always looking for how better ratings can be found in different immediate outcomes. I should say there are also ways to fall into grey listing by technical compliance, but it's highly unlikely that will be applicable to the Isle of Man in these circumstances. There's been a couple of updates to the standards since the last round, which I'll touch on briefly. It would only be relevant if you were really FATF geeks in the room, but I will go through them quite quickly. The risk-based approach, I've mentioned it. Recommendation 1 has been updated to improve and enhance the parts around simplified due diligence. What's been happening globally is a phenomenon of global de-risking. Many of you will be familiar with it from your own organisations. That is having a much greater impact in developing countries where people are effectively being excluded from the financial marketplace by virtue of people overly applying FATF Recommendation 1. The pendulum has now swung the other way, and the FATF says you must consider applying simplified due diligence where it is justified. So countries now have to actively consider where simplified due diligence can be applied. That's something that isn't so relevant here in the Isle of Man, but there are a number of projects that the FSA are currently considering for exemptions, which are effectively, when you think about exemptions and simplified due diligence, you can talk about them in the same sentence. It could either be an exemption or simplified being applied. There will be a number of ways the Isle of Man can talk about that as we get to the evaluation. The beneficial ownership standards have been completely rewritten. They were rewritten during and after COVID. I was part of the group that led on the revisions to legal persons in Rec 24. It's enhanced a number of things around this where countries were effectively getting away with not having beneficial ownership information available. It's not hugely applicable to the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man already had a regime in place which was broadly effective, but there are a number of technical updates that need to be made. And there will be consultations being released in the relatively near future from Registry and others, which will show how that will update Registry and FSA, particularly how you administer the Beneficial Ownership Act, the 2017 Act. Those are areas that will require a level of updating. Asset recovery provisions, I mentioned we'd come back to this. The FATF have expanded the scope to encourage the use of non-conviction-based asset recovery, and that's effectively allowing for more assets to be basically restrained and recovered. NPO sector measures, there have been, again, a bit like Rec 1, changes to try and encourage countries to not over-regulate certain not-for-profit organisations. This has again been down to the fact that there's been de-risking in the NPO sector because mainly financial institutions have made it harder for NPOs to carry out their activity, which is genuinely activity that's beneficial to the world. And then there's an enhanced focus, as I've mentioned, on financial inclusion. Immediate outcomes, they broadly replicate the same areas. So IO2, international cooperation, so an enhanced focus on asset recovery. IO5, again, beneficial ownership. IO8, asset recovery as well, new standards and alignment with the Council of Europe Warsaw Convention. IO10 clarifies the not-for-profit organisation measures. IO3 and IO4, not so much in terms of a change, but the IO is split, so IO3 focuses now just on financial institutions and VASPs. IO4 focuses on designated non-financial businesses and professions. And then, as we've mentioned before, the enhanced structural elements on financial inclusion and proportionality of measures. So that's the boring, geeky stuff as to how the methodology has been updated. So what can you do to prepare for MONEYVAL? Well, there are a number of things which are pretty important where you can do. The first, and it's something that lovely kind of segues into Ashley's presentation, is as the national risk assessments are published, you can consider them, review them, and incorporate them into your own practice and your own work by updating your business risk assessments and appropriate policies and procedures. We've seen the publication of the terrorist financing risk assessment. We'll soon be moving to the publication of the not-for-profit organisation risk assessment, although that won't be so relevant for all of you. And as we get towards the end of the year, the effectively 4 big sector risk assessments and the overarching money laundering national risk assessment will be published, which Ashley will update you on. All of those are critical, so reviewing them, understanding them, engaging with the government and the FSA as to what they mean for your business, those are all really important things that you can do. So you should engage senior management about the MONEYVAL process, be ready to explain your approach to AML CFT, how you do things in your own firm, and how you might do that if you're asked to meet with MONEYVAL. You should promote a culture of compliance, regular training and awareness sessions across the firm. And you should review your documentation, so look at your policies, procedures and records. I'm sure you do that anyway in advance of ongoing supervisory visits, but that's something to look at and consider in light of the fact that there'll be a broader approach to this in MONEYVAL. And you should stay informed, monitor the FSA and the government channels. There'll be more and more information coming out over the next year, and come along to events like this, be ready to receive that and go forward. Now, I mentioned I'd finish on talking about country training. So country training is due to be on the 26th, 27th of November. It's a morning session open to industry participants. It will talk about the FATF methodology, the procedure for how the evaluation goes on, and the evaluation timeline. And that will be delivered by 2 members of the MONEYVAL Secretariat, so you'll get to hear from them. And there'll be an industry Q&A opportunity. So like today, you can hear from them directly as to how the process will go. But in advance of that, I encourage you to also spend some time asking us questions in the panel. So I'm going to pass back to Ashley now, and then I'm very happy to take any questions talking about my areas of experience when we get to the panel. So Ashley, over to you to speak about the NRA. Good.
Thanks, George. Before I get into the NRA as well, just to pick up on country training, we did email out an Eventbrite link for that to professional bodies to disseminate. There are limited spaces on that, but hopefully you've all received the link. If you haven't, could you just let me know at the end, and I can just make sure that that's sent out wider if need be. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about a really critical project, as George mentioned, that is underway across the government, and that's our National Risk Assessment, or the NRA. So I'm going to talk about what it is, explain what we're doing, touch on the timelines, and finish by talking about what you can do to help as part of that project. Right, why have my slides frozen? Right, okay, thanks. Right, okay, so before I describe what the NRA is and why it's important, I just want to do some scene setting. Apologies if you have heard this before, but it is really important to cover these points. So as George has spoken to, our MONEYVAL evaluation is really significant for us as a jurisdiction. But I just want to emphasise that combating financial crime is a constant year-round commitment. This is not a box-ticking exercise that we're doing for the evaluators. It is really significant that we do well as a jurisdiction. Our collective efforts to combat money laundering, terrorist financing and proliferation financing, or MLTFPF, it's really important to protect our island from those who might be seeking to exploit it. And just to say that everybody in this room has a role to play in detecting, preventing and disrupting financial crime. Again, as George has mentioned about effectiveness, demonstrating effectiveness of our framework is really, really important, and it requires us all to work together to show that effectiveness. And one of the really sort of big takeaways from our 2016 evaluation was how important data is. So when we had our evaluation in 2016, we were very much lacking the data. So when the government was submitting all of its documentation, we were giving, sort of providing our narrative and explaining our story, but we actually didn't have all the data to back up what we were saying. And actually the data is really critical as part of the NRA as well. And I'll come on to that a little bit later in the presentation. But what we're looking to do is to have a really good body of evidence that we've got quite granular data, but we can slice and dice that data to really tell our narrative. So again, like I said, I'm going to talk about data, but it's just so essential. And I just want to thank all the firms for the data submissions. I know it's a big job, but hopefully as I talk through the NRA project, you really will see the importance of the data that we collect and why we collect it. Okay, so NRA, again, apologies. I feel like I've been talking about the NRA for nearly 2 years now, so you might have heard some of this already. But just to kind of recap, the purpose of our NRA is to identify, understand and assess those ML, TFPF risks that we face as a jurisdiction. It's to make sure that we have the right control framework in place. So we've talked about a risk-based approach this morning, and in order for us to have a risk-based approach, we need to identify the risks that we face. This helps us make sure that resources at a government level are targeted at those areas of higher risk. It also allows us as a jurisdiction to have a risk-based approach in our code. So in the AML CFT code, there are certain sections covering simplified measures. In order to have that flexibility and to have that risk-based approach, we need to identify the risks first to allow us to see what areas we can have simplified measures in respect of maybe a lower risk sector or a lower risk customer. But conversely, we've also got to make sure that we have enhanced measures where we've got some higher risk customers. The risk-based approach and understanding our jurisdictional risks also allows us as a supervisor to make sure that we apply our resources in those right areas. It's really important as well that we have a robust risk assessment. We've talked about technical compliance and effectiveness this morning, but the recommendation one is basically making sure that we have a risk assessment. We've got a documented risk assessment. Immediate outcome one is then about, is it a robust risk assessment? Have we got the right data and the right evidence to back up that risk assessment? And actually, as a jurisdiction, are both we as the supervisors and as the government and you as industry, are you using that risk assessment? Do you understand that risk assessment and use it to inform documents like your business risk assessment, your customer risk assessments? So recommendation one and immediate outcome one, they have what we call a cascading effect, whereby they are the absolute core of our regime, because it is the risk assessment that allows us to have that risk-based framework. So if we don't have a robust risk assessment, then we might not have the right control framework in place as a jurisdiction. So it's really important that we do this right. Sorry, I'm having tech problems. Has that changed? Oh, thanks. Thank you. Sorry, the tech is not cooperating with us today, as you can see from these slides. But we will post these slides after, because I'm aware some of the text is cut off. Right, so we are busy working on our third national risk assessment. It includes a number of topical and sectoral risk assessments. Just before I sort of go into the detail, it's really important to remember that we do obviously already have an NRA. We've had an NRA since 2015. So although we are doing a lot of work at the moment updating that, we do have one that you should already be familiar with, and that has been updated twice before. I mean, really, I think the threat and the vulnerability landscape have changed and have evolved, but in terms of some of the product or the sectoral risks that are in our previous NRAs, we might be developing those, and there might be some more emerging risks sort of on the technology front, but there's not going to be huge changes in terms of product sectoral risk. So it will be really important for you to review sort of all of these NRAs as they come out. We will be ensuring that we do outreach as well on the NRA, which I will speak to you shortly on. But I'm just going to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're doing. So we are using the World Bank model. That is the model we have used since 2015. The World Bank model is really based on having industry involvement in that risk assessment process. I've seen some faces in the room who have come to our NRA sessions for different sectors, and we do really appreciate your engagement. We've got a number of other sectoral risk assessment meetings happening next week, so thank you to those who have volunteered for those. But I'm just working through all the sectors. It's quite a big job to get through each sector. And what we're going to be doing is in those sessions, some are quite advanced already, but we're talking about, you know, what you see from the industry perspective. What do you see as the key risks? So in terms of topical assessments, we will be doing what we're calling the overarching money laundering assessment. That's quite advanced at the moment. We're still working through that. And we'll probably be looking to publish that towards the end of the year or early in 2026. The financing of proliferation assessment is also quite advanced. The TF assessment has been published already. I really would encourage you to have a look at that. We will be doing a number of sectoral assessments, which I've mentioned. They'll be covering financial institutions and DNFBPs. A new component for us this year is we're doing a standalone assessment on virtual assets, but also virtual asset service providers. That'll be in that joint assessment. We are engaging with an external firm who sort of specialise in the area of virtual assets to help us with that one. And we have already had some engagement with the sector for that one as well. We will, following the National Risk Assessment, we will be publishing a National Risk Appetite Statement. So that will be talking to, as a jurisdiction, what risks do we face, and actually what's our risk appetite at a jurisdictional level. So when that is published, again, I would urge you to review that and make sure that that's reflected in your own BRA or in your risk appetite statement that you have as a firm. And just to mention data again, we are in a really good place with our data thanks to the firms. We're in a much better starting position than we have been in the previous NRAs. I shut Teams before. That is really annoying. I'm going to throw my laptop out the window in a minute. Okay. And it is the data that informs the NRA. So it's just the data is absolutely critical to do a robust job on these risk assessments. And the other thing in terms of outputs is that we have the National Risk Appetite Statement, but we'll also have the findings from the NRA will feed into our financial crime strategy that we'll publish as a government. And we'll have a national action plan, which will have action points for us to do following the publication of the NRA. Okay. I am just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the legal persons and arrangements risk assessment. This is another new risk assessment. And actually, for our jurisdiction, it really is fundamental, considering the volume of companies and trusts that we have on the Isle of Man. So this particular risk assessment will be looking at the risks posed by the different vehicles that we use here on the Isle of Man and the industry use. We do acknowledge that we needed to collect a lot of data from the TCSP sector for this assessment, and we do really appreciate the work that went into that data request. I'm really pleased to say that we had a 100% response rate, which is great. And this particular assessment will be of importance to us because of that volume of companies that I mentioned. The data request was essential for us to be able to complete this risk assessment. It was data that was at a level of detail that we did not hold already. And we really did try to sort of use what we had, but it just simply wasn't enough to inform this risk assessment. So this particular risk assessment is looking at a range of factors. It's looking at the scale of business provided using different vehicles, what sort of assets they might hold, complexity of the different structures, any connections to PEPs, for example, what jurisdictions companies are operational in. We have been making sure that we do liaise with industry a lot on this risk assessment, particularly the TCSP sector, as the sector that services a lot of these companies. The input has been really vital to us. And we hope that we've given you, some feedback as well on how we're using that data and what we found from that data. But discussions will keep ongoing on that risk assessment as work advances. Okay, so in terms of publication, I've already mentioned TF is already out. More are to follow throughout the rest of this year into early 2026. We will be publishing standalone risk assessments for the sectors shown on screen. And that is because they are either sectors that do pose a higher risk or simply are very material to our jurisdiction. So they're the sectors that we've selected that will have standalone reports. All of the other sectoral work that we are doing will go into the overarching money laundering assessment. It is a big project. we really are trying to do, a really robust job with this. So what you will see published, and there will be a lot of pages published, that's only really touching the surface. We've got so much work behind the scenes that we can use as our evidence when it comes to our assessment and to show the effectiveness of our risk assessment. It's really important that you become familiar with all of these risk assessment documents. We will be looking at different outreach that we can do. We'll be running some sessions. We're going to look at doing some sort of summary sheets for each sector that you can use to help, to help sort of guide your thoughts on it. But you really do have to read the sectors in full. But we'll be trying to sort of help with that understanding of the NRA as we go. And you will need to incorporate it into your own business risk assessment in terms of the high-level findings. We will be updating our AML CFT handbook. I know there's a date in there at the moment, but just ignore that. We will be reissuing that document just to reflect the difference in timelines at the moment. The other thing that we will be doing is we will be looking at the sector guidance. Also aware we haven't updated the sector guidance for some time. To be honest, we've just put that on hold while we finish the NRA, because the findings from the NRA will feed into that sector guidance. So that will be coming down the track as well. The other thing that we will be doing, some of you might have seen, we've got some sector reports on our website. So they are different to the sector guidance and they're different to the NRA. They are reports, factual reports, if you like, on the data that we have collected from you. They are historic on there, and we are doing a project to update those because we've since moved on to Strix. So those previous sector reports were done when we got the data in the Excel format. We hope to be able to give you a much better product now that we've got Strix. We've got some really good visuals that we can put into those sector reports. And those sector reports are just to give you a factual view on the sector that you're in. So in terms of the sector as a whole, what are the sort of customer numbers across the sector? How are the risk ratings split? How many PEPs are there in the sector? So it's all the data is aggregated. Nothing's identifiable. It's just looking at it at a high sector level to help inform your BRA. So there'll be three things really you need to be looking at, which will be the NRA and all its supporting documents, the sector-specific AML guidance, and then the sector reports. All of that should give you a really good understanding of your sector and where we are as a jurisdiction. Okay. So, how can industry help? Some of this will be similar to some of the points that George made earlier, but please provide data through Strix. In terms of the AML CFT return, that is due end of March, and that will be live in January. We've got an early user testing group as well, where we're showing the return to them in advance and just sort of seeing if there's any concerns, any questions. Receiving that data in a timely manner is really critical for us to help us understand our risks, to feed into the NRA, as I've explained. Please come to us if you have queries on the AML return at your earliest convenience. We will have a dedicated support team. There's a dedicated email. We'll have a dedicated phone line. And we're here to help you on that point. Please make sure your risk assessments are up to date. Obviously mentioned that to death today, but we've got the new NRA. We've got all the new supporting documentation. Make sure you review it. Make sure you feed it into your BRA. We are going to be doing a number of outreach sessions as well. Please engage with that outreach. It might be in the form of webinars, events, but please do come along. Please let us know if there's any topics you want us to cover as well, any different formats you want. We're absolutely happy to take that feedback on board. Please ensure that your compliance functions are well resourced. We did a webinar actually on our website where we discussed this topic. I think it was in the April event this year that we held here at the museum, where we delivered that to heads of compliance. And we've also delivered a similar session to directors, which we did last year as well. You know, it's really important to do all of these things, to make sure your risk assessments are up to date, because when we do have the evaluation, George has mentioned the interviews, and the assessors will be asking you, you know, what do you see as the key risks within your business? What do you see as the key risks for the Isle of Man? So all of this engagement is going to be really critical as we move through that evaluation preparation. So just to conclude, significant work is underway regarding the NRA and generally our evaluation preparations. We do have a lot to do as a jurisdiction. From the jurisdictions that have recently completed their evaluations, a common thread we hear is that collaboration is key. It's really important that we can showcase to the evaluators that we can work together, and really important that the politicians, regulators, and businesses are all on the same page. Just to say as well, we do ask that any concerns you do have, please come and speak to us, please raise them. An interview with the MONEYVAL assessors really isn't the time to raise those concerns, when actually we could try and work together to address it beforehand. So please do contact us if you've got ideas on events, on topics, any queries you've got, any constructive feedback. We do listen to it and we do act upon it. So we recognise there is a lot to do. Hopefully, myself and George have outlined, you know, why it's so critical today. And we just ask that we can work together, work through the challenges that lie ahead. It is going to be a difficult time, but it is all for the good of our jurisdiction. So that is me. Sorry for my tech issues. Sorry, these slides as well. We have a panel session now. I mentioned at the beginning, we've got both FSA representatives and Cabinet Office representatives. So Lucy Hendy, who is a senior manager in our AML CFT division, is going to be sort of facilitating the panel for us. And then on the panel will be myself from the FSA. I've got Matt Tuzel, who's our head of enforcement and intelligence at the FSA. I've got Julie Christian, who's the head of AML CFT policy office and is our head of delegation for the Isle of Man. And I've got George, who you met earlier. So please send questions into Slido, and we will happy to take questions from the floor as well. So thank you.
Okie dokie. Right, we've had quite a lot of questions through on Slido. So I'm going to start with some of the most popular ones, if that's all right. We talked about the NRA and the timelines being slightly delayed to what was initially published. How can we demonstrate effectiveness, and how can industry be ready? That's probably one for...
I'll kick off, George,
Ashley,
and then I
George,
might get you to add on. Okay, yeah. God, sorry, that's so loud. Yeah, we are delayed. Hopefully today I've given you a bit of a flavour of why it's delayed, because we really are making sure that we do a really robust job on the NRA, because I mentioned it's the cascading effect of IO1 and Recommendation 1. It is really, really important that we can demonstrate, you know, why we have our control framework that we do. In terms of being ready and effectiveness, I would say, as I mentioned, that it is a refreshed NRA, and then there will be some new content, but we do already have our previous NRAs as well, which you should be familiar with. Some of the, as I mentioned as well, some of the product and sectoral risks, they haven't sort of fundamentally changed, although our threat and our vulnerabilities landscape have. But just familiarise yourself with what's out there already. That should already be reflective in your BRA, and familiarise yourself with the documentation as they are published, as they come through. And when the assessment team are here, our period of assessment is from our previous evaluation, so it's 2016 through to now. So I do think as a jurisdiction, we have got quite a good story to tell because we've already had risk assessments in place since 2015, and they should be reflective already in your BRA. I don't know if George or Gilly want to add anything further to that.
So I think the importance here is to put in context what being delayed actually means. So I think I have never found a jurisdiction that doesn't find themselves delayed in an NRA exercise. Other things come up, other things they want to do. When we work with jurisdictions to try and advise them, we say the more time spent in planning and planning for the unexpected is sometimes the better. But risk understanding is an ongoing issue. You're now required to assess that risk throughout the whole of the period that Ashley's just mentioned. So that's now since your last evaluation. And there are going to be points to explain what the risk understanding was. So there's the 2015 NRA, there's the 2020 NRA. There are different statements that have been made over that time. And with this particular money laundering national risk assessment, I think it's really important that it is as comprehensive as possible because of the increasing focus on risk. So spending more time to make sure that the results are as comprehensive and as complete as possible is advisable. Also, it's highly likely that the whole suite of risk assessments will be published at the latest by early next year. Probably towards the end of this year, most of it will be coming out. That still gives you a significant period of time in order to integrate those conclusions into your own processes. It's 10 months before the MONEYVAL team arrive on site. That's not a short period of time. In Jersey, we published a risk assessment the week before the evaluation team arrived. The evaluation team were not very happy about that, but we talked them through it and we explained what that was. It was also a refresh of something we'd done 2.5 years before. So it's not an unusual situation. I don't think it's something that the Isle of Man should be worried about. More importantly, they should be focused on making sure that this is as complete as possible.
Great, thanks very much. George, you talked about interviews and sector representatives being invited for interviews. So there's a couple of questions around that. What will be asked of us in interview and how we can prepare? How can we prepare? How will we find out if we're picked? And to just bundle into that question, is it purely compliance staff that MONEYVAL will want to talk to, or will senior management be included?
So I think what I'll do from that, I'll talk to you more about the interviews, then I'll pass to Gilly to talk about how you'll be briefed on kind of what will go on during the process up until next October. So to take the last question first, Lucy, if that's okay. No, it's not just compliance staff, although compliance staff, given that many of you here, I imagine our compliance staff are very important to the process. Usually they will want to see if you're a larger firm, so if you're a bank or a larger trust company or a large insurance provider, they'll usually want to see someone who represents the management level of the firm. So that will be a board representative. They will usually want to see the person who's the MLRO. And if you are large enough to have other internal control functions, maybe someone from those internal control functions as well. So if you are in an individual session of an interview, usually around 3 people is the right number of people to bring. If you are a designated non-financial business and profession and you only have 12 staff, then clearly one person turning up who's responsible for those functions is appropriate. In terms of the questions that they will ask you, there will be a range of questions that they will ask you, and that will be covered in briefings to you kind of before we get to the evaluation. It broadly follows the methodology, so it looks at your risk understanding, how you apply preventative measures, the different types of enhanced due diligence that the methodology calls out, how you might apply simplified due diligence in certain circumstances. And they will also ask you, most importantly, about your relationship with the authorities, and that will mainly be your relationship with the FIU, with the supervisor, with the sanctions unit, with anyone else that you're speaking to. And it's really important in that to think about narrative. So that gives you a kind of, I guess, a general overview of the questions. Gilly, I'll pass to you to talk about how the industry will get a bit more briefing, I think, before next October.
Thanks, George. I think the key areas that we'll be kind of focusing on in terms of outreach and preparations into next year will be firstly the NRA. Once we have that published, we'll be pushing out more outreach in relation to that. But there is also the other side to it, the preparations as we've mentioned. So we'll be really looking at how we can tailor those for sectors and how we can really get you ready moving into next year. So This could be breakfast sessions, could be larger forums, or it could be smaller workshops as well. So we're always open to any feedback that you might have as well, or any suggestions essentially on what will work for you and for your businesses. But you'll start to see it really ramping up into next year as we move into that sort of evaluation territory.
How they'll find out they'll be picked.
Of course. We'll later on this year and into next year, about 6 months out, we'll have a list on representatives that we'll put forward. Now, the way that MONEYVAL choose is they have all sorts of different methods, really. It's difficult for us to really identify every single person, and they'll be able to choose outside of the list that we provide as well. But about 6 months out, we'll learn that list, and then we can start to share that with you.
Great, thanks very much. A burning question, it seems, lots of popularity upvotes. Are there any additions to the AML CFT Strix return? And if so, when will they be communicated? Ashley, I know you touched on the Strix return. I know we're not anticipating any material changes, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
I think that probably covers it, Lucy. Yeah, no material changes, you'll be pleased to know. More what we're describing as tweaks. We'll also be making sure that we update the guidance. And we'll make sure we flag anything that is slightly changed as well, maybe in a different colour, so that you can clearly see what has changed in the return. But yeah, nothing material at this time.
Great, thank you. Okay, a question that's come in specifically to you, George. Is a civil penalties regime for individuals really necessary for the Isle of Man?
So the easiest way to put this is that the FATF precedent requires it as necessary for all jurisdictions in the world. It requires in the methodology for you to have proportionate and effective penalties for both institutions and individuals. If the Isle of Man were not to bring in this regime, it would pretty much be the only Crown dependency or overseas territory that has not brought in a regime for individuals. So it would be an outlier. Now, is there a way that the Isle of Man could still try and demonstrate it was effective without it? Yes. Would it be much harder? Infinitely harder. And I think it would be looked down upon by the likes of the FATF, by the likes of MONEYVAL, and potentially by the likes of the United Kingdom, and it could impact the constitutional relationship in that regard as well. It's controversial in every jurisdiction. When we brought it in Jersey, I had huge controversy when we brought in the original civil penalties regime in 2014, even more controversy when we brought in the penalties on individuals. One thing I would encourage you to think about is the enabling power, which is effectively the tin mould basically passing the enabling power is not the important thing. The important thing is then how the enabling power is used. And that would require you to be engaging with the FSA on their consultations on that, which probably nicely allows me to segue past this to Matt or Ashley to talk about how that would occur. So there will need to be, if that power is not in place, the Isle of Man would find themselves as an outlier. And I think it would be reasonable to suspect that that would be written up as a significant technical and effectiveness deficiency in the regime. Matt, Ashley, past you to talk about then how that might translate down into how such a power might be used.
I'll cover some elements. It's probably worth me highlighting what everyone is likely aware of, that there's been 2 recent consultations. That's where this is being covered. The feedback statements are being reviewed, and we'll be coming back out confirming next steps in November. Obviously, comments were invited, and as George has quite rightly said, what we're looking to do is to maintain the island's reputation as a well-regulated jurisdiction that continues to meet international standards. The feedback statements will explain any resulting changes to the bills, while separate consultation exercise will take place in 2026 on the secondary legislation, and that's the key element that we're talking about here. The consultation on the FSAA 08 bill covered the enabling power for the expanded regime, and it was noted that the scope and detail are defined in the secondary legislation. So what does that mean? Obviously, I'm picking that here just to make sure that it's covered. It's so important. But it's around that secondary regime where you will be consulted with again, and that's how we will go about implementing it. What does it mean? who does it cover? And probably just another important note to sort of refresh yourselves on who it actually means and the key people. It's not across the whole of industry. And I think it's clear in that consultation on where and the likely people that are to be captured.
I was just going to add one other point as well, just to say that the civil penalty regime that we are consulting on, it's not all about preventing financial crime as well. A penalty regime, a proportionate penalty regime, is part of our toolkit as a supervisor. So it's, although obviously as George mentioned, it is really important for our AML safety framework, it is wider than that as well.
I can also understand why industry are concerned about this, but one area I would encourage you to have a look at is the judgments against individuals in other Crown dependencies and relevant overseas territories. For those of you who haven't had a look at the fines on individuals in Guernsey and in the Cayman Islands that have been used so far. Those are areas where you can see how the GFSC and CIMA have applied the regime. Interestingly, in both jurisdictions, they've been subject to legal challenge. In Guernsey, I think there's been one challenge on the individuals, which was successful at first instance and then overturned in the Court of Appeal. And in Cayman, they've seen a substantive challenge at the legal regime against a very large penalty against a law firm in the Cayman Islands, which again was successful at first instance and then again overturned on appeal. So just to give everyone an idea, these regimes are being legally challenged in other jurisdictions, and those are being upheld in terms of where things are. I think we've got one question in the audience, but...
It's just one thing. It talks about the secondary legislation, and that's absolutely critical, completely agree. But it's also the process for making those determinations, and the Isle of Man process, which is the enforcement process, is materially different to that in other overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. And I would sort of suggest the FSA need to really consider that from a human rights point of view, fairness of arms and everything else. So actually something that's aimed at institutions who might hold that information that the individual needs to actually protect themselves may not be the most appropriate way forward. So it's just a comment.
Yeah, no, thank you for the comment, and it will be noted, it will be recorded and fed back to the team that are specifically handling this issue at this time.
Right, thanks very much. So there are a few more kind of enforcement related questions that we'll just cover at the moment, I think. We're seeing enforcement action and you know, we're getting closer to the evaluation. Does this suggest poor effectiveness? Is this an area of concern? So poor effectiveness in that we're having to take action against firms. But I suppose conversely, could it be suggested that we are effective in the use of our powers? And you know, is there any mitigations that we can put in place? So Matt, I don't know if that's...
I think I'll kick off and others may be able to contribute. And I think you were touching upon elements, and it's a balance, and there's going to be a balance in everything we do. And obviously what you're going to get from me as head of enforcement may lean towards the sanctions side. But it's important to note that actually demonstrating the sanctions, it's not just about, so to meet our sort of FATF methodology, it's important about applying sanctions in practice, not just having the legislation. So, and others will talk to it more clearly than I, but the difference between the technical element and the effectiveness. So it's important that we can demonstrate an effective use of our powers under those regimes. What I'd like to bring in just quickly before I do pass on to anyone else is just to understand and have an appreciation that it's not all about enforcement activity. And those that have heard me before, I'll just take this opportunity to reiterate that we're not an enforcement-led regulator. I think in this room earlier in the year, I gave some data for the 2023-2024 period. We've got updated data now that covers 24-25. So to give you an indication there, I think there were 296 inspections, and those inspections for that period, 24-25, that was a mix of just short of 100, I think 98 inspections that were event-driven, supervisory methodology or thematic inspections, and they're a mix of on-site and desk-based, and the remainder being topped up by beneficial ownership inspections. Of them, the internal governance referral panel, so that has to meet and that decides what the most appropriate next step is. One of those discharge routes is to a referral to enforcement. That panel only met 15 times and of those, only 8 referrals were made to enforcement. And again, the internal governance and assurance and checks and measures, that also doesn't mean that just because 8 came to my team, that we adopted all 8, and actually, when we work through those investigations, that the discharge route is some form of sanction, because it isn't an automatic process. So there's every chance that we can investigate as an enforcement team, and our output could be no further action or a re-referral back within the authority for what we consider at that time, subject to, again, another case review panel agreeing with our recommendation, but that a more suitable discharge route elsewhere within the authority is appropriate. I know I went off on a slight tangent there, but hopefully that covers from the enforcement angle.
I was just going to talk about kind of culture of enforcement and what we see globally. So it's really difficult to it's difficult to define a thread, but if there is a thread, the culture of enforcement in countries changes, in my view, by the duration of the time the enforcement regime has been in force. Take the United States of America, so pretty much the jurisdiction that's had the regime in force for the longest. There is absolutely no concern in the well, there is concern, but there is an acceptance in the industry of the way that enforcement works, and penalties are dealt with on a daily basis by firms. That's how it works. The UK is not hugely behind, but when the FCA or the FSA, as it was then, brought those regimes in, it was again controversial. In IFCs, what we tend to see is enforcement having come in more recently, i.e. the legal powers for enforcement having come in more recently, and therefore their usage and the reaction is more extreme because they're new. The authorities rightly are cautious in using their powers because they are concerned about using them correctly and the risk of legal challenge, and the industry are navigating a new regime of how penalties work. So you see this kind of variation. What we see in international reports in the FATF, MONEYVAL and other FSRBs, for what it's worth, is that IFCs are almost always, in most reports, criticised for relying at supervisory level too heavily on remediation and not using enforcement appropriately. It is absolutely feasible that that would be a finding that could be in the Isle of Man report in due course, depending on where the team go. And the need to show this balance that Matt has talked about is really, really important. I have argued for years for Jersey that actually remediation and also the use of things like public statements in a small jurisdiction are incredibly effective, because if you are the subject of a public statement in any of our jurisdictions, pretty much your career is probably over. That yields mixed responses with larger jurisdictions. The US have no care for that. Their view is name and fine. That's the only acceptance, whereas other smaller jurisdictions in MONEYVAL will be more accepting of that. So this balance isn't like a clear view. If you go one side or the other of this, so you automatically fine on everything, that would be really bad. If you say, actually, we don't even believe we need a regime, that will also be really bad. So you need to find that middle spot in the middle. And I think the answer in terms of whether action closer to the evaluation is an indicator of poor effectiveness, I don't think that's the correct assumption. There is an acceptance that the regime will only have been in place for a certain period of time and that it will be being used in a more cautious way. And so I think anything that's showing that evolving balance, and that maybe the evolving balance hasn't reached its eventual equilibrium, is fine. But it's not a simple issue. This is in every country, particularly in small countries, this is an incredibly controversial issue.
And just to sort of double down on one thing, just to hopefully finish on that topic, just to reiterate that we will only take enforcement action when it is reasonable, appropriate, and proportionate to do so. So the data that I went through, yeah, it's a little over 2%, I think, is the amount of cases that come to my team to investigate. But we only take that action for the right reasons. And I think that's just to demonstrate, both from a data perspective, but also that it's not done for MONEYVAL, it's not done for any other alternative purposes.
One final thing. Okay. I would really encourage you all to read the penalties in other ground dependencies and overseas territories, read the public statements. I know there are views that for some of the firm penalties, that some of the way that regulators have used them is maybe overzealous. I accept that there's some of that. If any of you read the individual penalties or the named individuals in any of the Crown dependencies and overseas territories and come to me and say you didn't think what they did is that bad, I would be very surprised. The activity and what is actually cited, when you actually get into the statement and you read it, most people in Jersey that we work with from the industry will read it and go, well, if they did that, I can't believe they didn't expect that that would be the eventual outcome. So I would really encourage everyone to read the penalties.
Yeah. No.
I just wanted to add one other thing. I think Matt and George have alluded to it a little bit in their answers as well, but a public statement or a penalty, that's only part of our toolkit as well. When we talk about sanctions, and that's the terminology used in the FATF standards, it's looking for a range of sanctions. So we obviously do have civil penalties as one of our options, but there's a number of other things that we can do. Remediation is the sort of starting point. But then there's other things in our toolkit, so the use of maybe a license condition or a direction, which is private between us and the firm. So there are other things that we do sort of behind the scenes that maybe you wouldn't see as well. But we don't, as Matt's shown in the numbers, we don't always just go for a civil penalty. We do look at the other avenues available.
Thank you. That's kind of covered off another question that was in here on Slido that was asking about inspections or inspections where enforcement action isn't the outcome. So Matt covered that one off. Now, just skipping back to the NRA, where's that question gone? The NRA is, we've seen the NRA updated every 5 years, so 2020, 2015, 2020. The question was around, we ask firms to update their business risk assessments regularly and make sure they're up to date. Is every 5 years for an NRA appropriate? I don't know who.
I can kick off and pass to Gilly, but I would say we need to do it more regularly than on a 5-yearly cycle, even if it's just a refresh. But I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on timelines, Gilly.
I think just to be sort of clear from an FATF perspective, they don't actually kind of prescribe how often an NRA should be done. I think, adding to Ash's point, I think there is definitely scope for us to update it more regularly, and it's something that we can look to as we move out of the MONEYVAL evaluation and things are more settled from that perspective, and we can start then to look at how we can update the NRA more effectively and more efficiently. As we've noted, it has taken longer than expected this time round, but with the data that we now collect, particularly from your firms, there's definitely scope there for us to have more comprehensive updates over a shorter period of time. I don't know whether there's anything that you wanted to add there. Oh yeah, of course. So, of course, there's trigger events as well. So, if anything material changes within our sort of threat profile, from money laundering or terrorist financing or anything else, and we are able to update either perhaps sectorally or in those individual components of the NRA. We do have that option now, particularly that we have done it from a bottom-up approach this time, and we have those more standalone documents.
And I would just add, there was, of course, a kind of a trigger event in relation to the King Gaming matter, where there was the publication of new typologies and a risk appetite statement, and that was a reaction to an emerging risk and typology for the sector. That also forms part of risk understanding. So it's not just these formally published NRAs that demonstrate risk understanding, there are other things. In terms of the broader view of the question, maybe I can take from other countries, there is, exactly as Julie said, there is a range of approaches that countries are taking, but I think what's useful to understand here in the Isle of Man is after the publication of this risk assessment, and probably after the MONEYVAL evaluation, and maybe while the report is in the process of drafting, thinking about how it can be done better, more intuitively on a more ongoing basis in the future is where countries are going. I think there's also an increasing use of countries of thinking about how through technology with which they engage with firms, how that can be used more effectively to, on both ways, understand risk from a firm side and from an authority side. So, yeah, the idea of publishing large PDF documents every 4 to 5 years is not really, I think, the modern route of risk understanding. There's a way things can go, but yeah, there's no clear rule.
Great, thank you. I'm just conscious on time, but we'll squeeze a few more questions in. There was a question on here, how do we get involved in the collaboration working groups for the NRA? So I'll just quickly answer that. Every working group that we've formed, we've invited people through industry and sector associations, societies, that kind of thing. But if it's something that you're specifically keen to get involved in, do drop us a note, nra@iomfsa.im, or just grab Ashley or I after the session. Now, there's a question which is on prosecution, so it might not be best suited to this panel, but I will ask it anyway to see if anyone has any comments. Given the low number of prosecutions and confiscations that have been highlighted in previous MERs, how's the Isle of Man, do we think, going to fare when actual criminality occurs off island? And will our level of SARS reporting be taken into account?
So I'll talk internationally about how low numbers of prosecutions and international cooperation where the predicate criminality is occurring overseas. Then I'll pass to Gilly maybe to talk a little bit about some of the work that's being done domestically to enhance that area. So it's very usual that in IFCs there are no convictions in line with the risk profile. That was the position in the Jersey report. The reason is the cases are often highly complex, reliant on a lot of international cooperation, and take, in a number of our cases, are approaching decades to progress, and there is still a chance that they will reach a courtroom. What you do is instead you show the evaluation team the workings in an incredibly confidential setting with investigators, basically, where they are able to see that you have the capacity to investigate these matters. They also look at things like non-conviction-based confiscation, so where it is not going to be possible to bring a matter to a courtroom in the Isle of Man to prove actual money laundering, whether you use other mechanisms to restrain and confiscate the assets within the ambit of the law in the Isle of Man. And the Isle of Man has been using those tools more frequently in the last couple of years. The dream, of course, if you can do it, is to extradite to your jurisdiction a criminal who has convicted awful crimes overseas and has stashed their money in the Isle of Man, and actually convict them. That is very much the aim of what the methodology tries to call for. That is recognised to be a very, very difficult thing to achieve. We achieved it. In Jersey, in the last period, we were able to extradite successfully individuals from Qatar and from Australia who had committed quite serious financial crimes and convict them in a dock in Jersey, but that is difficult. So yes, international cooperation is hugely important in this process as well. It doesn't just look at the money laundering convictions, it looks at whether you can do stuff with the assets, mainly restrain those assets to prevent them going back to criminals. So yeah, it won't be an easy task, but it is possible of being done. And I would say since this process started, the MONEYVAL effectiveness evaluations, there is a greater understanding amongst the legal assessors of the difficulty to do this in an IFC scenario. We are not a large jurisdiction like France, like Germany, where there is plenty of very bad predicate criminality occurring on shore. The Isle of Man has a very good stat that I believe you are indeed the safest place in the British Isles, even more than Jersey. So that's a great thing, but actually being able to do that is hard. Gilly might want to refer to some of the domestic changes that are looking to be made to enhance this, but alongside other issues in criminal justice, I guess.
Yeah, so you'll see that there's a consultation out currently for the Justice Reform Bill. So this will aid us in making the court sort of process more efficient and assisting on that side of things. The bill itself is huge, and there are multiple different avenues that aren't related to AML or CFT matters, but there are some key areas within that, like I say, will make that court process better.
I mean, I was going to just refer to a couple of them that's worth mentioning. So electronic service of evidence and what's known as old-style committals still exist here in the Isle of Man. I think you'll be the last place in the British Isles that those still continue to exist. Those are things that need to modernise for AML, but not just because of AML, because of modern criminal justice systems, which is what... There will be an appreciation of that. There is also a critical scenario that assessors also have to have an appreciation and understanding of the culture and customs of the jurisdiction they operate in. And it's perfectly reasonable for the Isle of Man to do that, as long as it shows it's thinking about the future and there are not major impediments to prosecuting money laundering, it will be okay.
I'm aware we haven't got through all of the questions on Slido, but I just wanted to give the opportunity if anyone wanted a question from the floor. We've got a roving mic. No? Okie doke. So, yeah, we've not got through quite all of the questions, so what we will do is we'll take those away and see if we can publish some responses to those when the webinar of this event is published on our website too. So that'll be in the next few weeks that the webinar will be published and the slides. So thank you all for attending. I hope you found it very useful. As Ashley mentioned, the authority staff and Cabinet Office representatives will be hanging around for a few minutes afterwards if you have anything you want to speak to us about directly. But if you'd join me in thanking our speakers and panel members, please.